What sort of mood are you expecting at this year's conference?
Well, I think I'm expecting a kind of contradictory mood. One is that Europeans and Americans will reassure themselves that in somehow they are still partners. But behind closed doors, Europeans will basically struggle with the fact how to become more independent from the US in such a way that it doesn't alienate the US right now from the Europeans. I think this is what we're currently seeing, you know?
A big part of this sort of equation is the efforts by Mark Rutte to keep NATO together. He's been working extremely hard through a number of issues to keep this going. What do you make of his efforts and the way they're going?
Well, actually, of course, I mean, this is the job of the NATO Secretary General. Sometimes my personal opinion is he forgot a bit that he's also the Secretary General of the Europeans. I mean, he's too busy in flattering the US. Yeah. So this would be my personal comment on the way he deals with his position. Secondly, I would say that even Rutte, despite his apparently good contacts in the US administration, and especially with the president, is not able to basically glue the US and the Europeans together. Because, I mean, even during his tenure, we've seen the national security strategy, the national defense strategy, and various statements by high-ranking US officials about transatlantic affairs, which are all indicating that the fundamentals, the pillars of these relations are eroding and being replaced. I'm not saying that basically we are in a process of divorce where basically we separate, but we will have a new fundament of transatlantic relations, which is totally different than the fundamentals we used to know from the past.
To make a quick detour then to Ukraine before we come back to this key issue of transatlantic ties, what do you see in terms of prospects for peace or ceasefire?
Honestly, I don't see any willingness on the side of the Russians to agree to certain ceasefire anytime soon. I think that the Russians still do believe, I mean, the Putin administration still do believe they can win this thing militarily. They're still insisting on no security guarantees for Ukraine. And as we speak, you know, we got the news today that these kind of security agreement between the US, the Europeans, and the Ukrainians has almost been finalized. Yeah. The Russians so far have always made clear they don't want to have any presence of any European forces on the ground. They still want Zelensky to give up the rest of the Donbas. The Ukrainians are currently still holding. This is the biggest chunk for Zelensky to swallow because it has to go through a referendum. So I don't see that the Russians will give in anytime soon to accept the ceasefire as it is proposed by, let's say, the US and the Europeans to the Russians.
Okay, so if we return to transatlantic ties, the European strategy, you've laid it out. They're trying to keep the Americans on board while they build up their own militaries and their own military industrial production capacity. I mean, I think most people would say becoming truly self-sufficient on defense is a question of years for Europe. Can or will Europe achieve this, do you think?
I mean, I apologize in advance. I think this is not the right question. Because that's my problem with the whole debate, you know? I mean, quite often we are talking in terms of European independence or sovereignty, as some are calling it too, with regard to what the US military is able to do. And I think this is the wrong level of ambition for the time being. Because, of course, the US military is a global power projection force, being able to deploy it in every corner of this world within a couple of hours. For the beginning, it should be Europe's ambition to be stronger than the Russians. Because, I mean, our threat situation is we have a Russian military threat against Europe. So looking at the US and what the US military is able to do, I think leads us to the wrong conclusion what we need to do in short term, midterm. Because of course, I mean, if we want to become as strong as the US military, if we ever get there, it will take us at least a decade and a half and would cost us even more than we are already spending and we committed to spend right now.
How realistic is it that that is going to happen, do you think, that that change will occur?
Well, it is occurring in some member states, and others I don't see it. So that's a problem. And the basic thing is, I think that a lot of that Europe is not united in its threat perception. And to put it quite simple, the further away you go, geographically speaking, from Moscow, the less Russia is considered as a real military threat to the European security structure. There is no debate about that in the Baltics, in the Nordics, and in large parts of Central and Eastern Europe. There is still, a debate about that in Germany, in Italy, in France, in Spain, and in Portugal. So, and that's the problem. There is no unifying threat perception right now. It varies.
Okay, now you mentioned the Baltics. It's a nice way to talk then about your book, If Russia Wins, which was published last year, and which is a discussion of a scenario in which Russia attacks the Baltics and NATO is paralyzed by internal divisions. So it's a sort of horror scenario from a European or a NATO perspective. From where we are today, what would you say, how sort of realistic is this scenario, or to what extent is this a genuine threat that this could happen?
Well, I think the scenario became even more realistic over the past year. I mean, the book has been published first in March 2025. We are now in February, beginning of February 2026. The scenario became more realistic. Why? Because in my book, I still had basically a kind of NATO alliance where the biggest NATO member didn't threaten another NATO partner with the use of force to take away its territory. This whole Greenland move did damage to the credibility of Article 5. If I were a Russian, I would ask myself, if the biggest power in the alliance threatens another a partner with the use of force, how credible is it that they are going to defend a much smaller NATO ally at the eastern flank if I chuck away only small parts of its territory?
Were you being unduly pessimistic about or are you being unduly pessimistic about, an American reaction to Russia invading Lithuania or a move of that nature?
I think I would distinguish two scenarios. Russia invading a country entirely, or Russia, like I wrote in my scenario, just taking a tiny city or whatever, a border city. In the later one, I'm overall pessimistic whether the US will basically be there. I mean, if you look at the national defense strategy, even at the national security strategy, at various speeches by high-ranking US officials in the administration, they make very clear that the US doesn't consider, first of all, the US doesn't consider Russia as a threat. They acknowledge that some Europeans, this is a quote, do consider Russia as a threat, but that the US doesn't look at themselves as the primary security guarantor when it comes to a conventional confrontation in Europe. So they're very adamant in the point that Europe has to deal with that by just relying on their own means. If the Russians would attack a NATO country entirely, this might change the equation. Then I would be not as pessimistic as I am with regard to the other scenario. Then I would say the chances that the US in one way or the other would basically join the Europeans in fighting this back is quite likely.
Let's just finish with perhaps something a little bit more personal. I just would like to ask you about your personal motivation for writing the book.
Actually, I started writing this book by, let's say, late summer 2024. We had all the reports by either external intelligence services or military intelligence services saying that by 2029, the Russians have an army that will be able to attack a NATO country if it is politically wanted. And then the debate started all over Europe, partly also in the US, and critics were saying, Russia is not so crazy to attack NATO because even the Russians don't know whether they can win such a war or not. And some even said, NATO is much stronger than the Russians, so they wouldn't do this. Another line of argument was, look at Ukraine, how slowly they progress there. How can you even think about, that they are attacking a NATO country? And I was like, maybe we're looking at that in the wrong way. Because if you look what Russia wants to achieve politically, this is the collapse of NATO, because that's the precondition to dominate what they consider as their legitimate sphere of influence, what they used to call near abroad. And to let NATO collapse, you probably don't need to attack Poland entirely. You don't need to attack Estonia entirely. You just need to basically attack a tiny piece of NATO's territory and then ask NATO whether to liberate this tiny piece, NATO is willing to risk this major conventional confrontation with a nuclear dimension. So that was the reason to change the perception, basically, of this whole debate if Russia will attack a NATO country by 2029 or a bit later.